I spent $2,000 to get to the United States, and in less than 30 days, I was put on a plane back to India with one suitcase, debts that were not mine alone to carry, and the impossible task of looking my parents in the eye after spending the savings they had built over years. But before I tell you how I was deported in my first month, I need to tell you what made me board that plane believing it would truly work out. Because it wasn't madness, it wasn't pure recklessness, it was hope. And hope, when it is desperate, can convince you of things that cold reason would never allow. What happened to me in those days? From the afternoon my cousin sent that first message about life in America to the night ICE officers stopped me on the footpath as I was walking back from work, is a story I took a very long time to be able to tell out loud. But if my story can make even one person think twice before taking the same path I took, then it is worth opening all of this up again. Stay with me, because what follows is real, and it is much more than a deportation story. There are days in life when you feel you are falling behind, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that others can see, but inside, in silence, there is a voice that whispers that time is passing and the life you imagined has still not arrived. I knew that voice very well. It woke me up too early and kept me awake too late. It was with me while I folded fabrics, while I noted down prices, while I smiled at customers and pretended everything was fine. That voice was responsible for everything that came after, and what came after changed my life in ways I am still processing even today. Karim Nagar is a city in the state of Telangana, in South India. It is not a small city, but it is also not the kind of city that appears in anyone's dreams when they think of opportunity. There are markets and temples, the sound of motorcycles and the smell of spices mixed with dust. There are entire families building their lives around a shop, a small farm, a government job that pays little but offers stability. That was the world I grew up in. And that was the world in which I learned that working hard does not necessarily mean moving forward. My father always had the cloth shop, a simple shop with wooden shelves darkened by time, rolls of silk, cotton, and synthetic fabric stacked to the ceiling. My mother sat at the counter. I helped from the age of 16, first during school holidays, then permanently, when it became clear that the family needed me there. I never complained out loud, but inside I always knew that was not what I wanted for my life. From early on, I had wanted to be a nurse. I am not exactly sure where that desire came from. Perhaps from when my grandmother fell ill, and I saw up close how a good healthcare professional can make all the difference in a moment of despair. Perhaps because caring for people always made sense to me in a way that folding cloth never did. I enrolled in a nursing diploma course when I was 23. I completed half of it. Then my father had a heart problem, spent months recovering, and money disappeared so quickly that I had to abandon everything and return to the shop full-time. By the time he recovered, that window had closed. The resources were gone, and I was nearly 25, feeling stuck in a dead end. The years that followed were a repetition. Wake up early, open the shop, attend to customers, close the counter, sleep, repeat. I saved what I could, but between the household expenses, my father's medicines, and the shop's running costs, what remained was never enough to change anything meaningful. At 32, I looked in the mirror and saw a woman who was tired, not of work, but of waiting. It was at that point that my cousin entered the story. Divya is the daughter of my mother's sister. We grew up together, played together, but we were always very different. She was always the one who stepped out, who tried things, who did not sit still waiting for life to happen. When she was 28, she got a work visa and went to the United States to work as a nanny for an Indian family in New Jersey. At first, her messages were short, just letting us know she had arrived safely, that she was adjusting. But as the months passed, the tone of her messages changed. She started sending photographs of enormous supermarkets with endless aisles, of green parks with children playing safely, of simple but clean apartments with heating in winter and a full refrigerator. She would send her monthly salary amount, and when I converted it to rupees, my heart would race. It was more than double what our entire shop earned in a full month. We started talking more. Long calls in the late afternoon, when the time difference allowed. She told me about her routine, about the children she looked after, about the English that was improving, about the weekends she used to explore the city. It was not a life of luxury, she made that clear. It was a life of hard work, but it was a life with some breathing room, with possibility, with the feeling that today's effort was building something for tomorrow. During one of those calls, she said something that stayed in my mind for weeks. Adira, you are good with people. You are organized. You would manage well. There is a lot of opportunity here for those who are willing to work. I said nothing in that moment, but inside me, a seed had been planted. I did not take the decision alone. That is important to say clearly. I spoke with my parents. A long, uncomfortable conversation, full of silence and unspoken things. My father was quiet for some time after I raised the subject. My mother began to cry even before I finished explaining. Not a cry of anger. The kind of cry a mother makes when she realizes her child is asking permission to leave. I explained everything Divya had told me. I explained that she knew people there, that she could help me find work, that I could save enough money in 1 year to pay off the family's debts, restock the shop, and still have something left for my own future. I spoke about a nursing course. I spoke about coming back different. I spoke with the certainty of someone who genuinely believes what they are saying. What I did not do was speak about the risks. Not because I was hiding them, but because at that moment, I simply was not seeing them clearly enough. My father took 3 weeks to give me an answer. One Sunday afternoon, he called me to sit with him on the back veranda of the shop. We spent some time in silence looking at the small garden my mother maintained. Then he said, "We have kept some money aside that is not in the business. We never spoke about it much because it is for emergencies. But perhaps the biggest emergency is letting you remain stuck here." I cried. He did not. But I saw in his eyes that this had cost something beyond money. The total savings, his and my mother's, combined with what I had put aside over the years, came to roughly 170,000 rupees. Converted to dollars at the time, that was approximately $2,000. It was enough to cover the travel costs, the fee for someone who would help with the documentation, and the first few days in the country until I could find work. I need to be honest about one thing here. From the beginning, I knew that my documentation situation was not straightforward. My tourist visa had been approved for a short visit. The intention to work, to stay longer, to build a life there, was not covered by that document. I knew this. Divya knew this. My parents perhaps did not know it with full clarity. And I, cowardly, did not make a point of spelling it out. There were people in Karim Nagar who had taken the same path. Acquaintances of acquaintances. Women who had gone on tourist visas, found work within Indian communities, sent money home for months or years, and returned later with enough capital to transform their family's situation. It was a path that existed, that worked for many people, and that I believed would work for me too. That was the greatest failure of reasoning in my life, not because the plan was absurd in itself, but because I completely underestimated the weight of everything that could go wrong. The trip was scheduled for a Thursday in February. My mother spent the 2 previous days cooking everything I loved. She packed some spices, a small packet of rice she said I would miss, and a small photograph of the temple near our home. My father came to the airport. He did not say much during the journey. When I said goodbye to him at the terminal entrance, he held my face in both his hands for a moment, looked into my eyes, and nodded, as if saying something that words could not carry. I walked into the airport carrying a medium suitcase, a backpack, and the weight of knowing that those savings, that sacrifice, that trust, were all resting on my shoulders. The flight stopped in Dubai and then continued to New York, nearly 22 hours in total. I slept little. I spent most of the time with my earphones in but no music playing, looking out the window at the dark emptiness outside and trying to imagine what the first day would be like. When the plane began its descent and I saw the first lights of New York through the window, I felt something I cannot quite name. It was a mixture of joy and fear, of hope and vertigo, the feeling of standing exactly on the edge between what you know and what you do not yet have the courage to imagine. I did not know in that moment that in less than 30 days I would be back at the airport, but this time without a choice and without dignity. JFK Airport is too large for someone arriving for the first time. It is not just the physical size, it is the corridors that seem to have no end. The signs in English you can read but take time to process, the unfamiliar smell of the air conditioning, the noise of languages you have never heard all at once. I held my backpack with both hands and tried to appear calm while inside. My heart was beating at an abnormal pace. The immigration queue was the hardest part of that first day, not because of the waiting time, though it was long, but because of the feeling of being watched by someone who has the power to send you back before you have taken a single step outside those walls. When my turn came, the officer looked at the passport, looked at me, asked a few questions in English about the purpose of my visit, how long I would stay, whether I had a confirmed address. I answered with the English I had, not fluent, but functional. I said I was visiting family. I gave Divya's address. He stamped the passport. I breathed. Divya was waiting for me outside, wearing a thick coat and smiling broadly. It was February, and the cold in New Jersey that night was a cold I had never felt in my life. It is not the cold of an AC room or a chilly night in Karim Nagar. It is a cold that enters through your clothes, through your bones, through your soul. She laughed when she saw me hunched over and said I needed a proper winter coat as soon as possible. The apartment where she lived was small, a room she shared with another Indian woman who worked at a beauty salon. I stayed on the sofa in the sitting room for the first few days. It was uncomfortable, but I was so relieved to have arrived that anything seemed fine. In those first days, Divya introduced me to the community. And this is something people outside do not quite understand about the immigrant experience. There is a network, an invisible but very real network, made up of people who came before and who, in some way, support those who come after. There are people who recommend jobs, who lend money in the first few days, who give you a lift because you do not yet know how to take the bus, who explain how the market, the pharmacy, the bank work. It was through this network that, in the second week, I got an interview. The shop was called something like Spice of India, a name I found beautiful the first time I heard it. It was a small establishment in a neighborhood where many South Asian people lived. It sold imported basmati rice, spices, specific flours, packaged Indian sweets, kitchen utensils. The kind of place where you walk in and smell something that takes you straight back home, even when you are over 12,000 kilometers away. The owner's name was Rajan, a man in his mid-50s, graying hair, fast talker, the air of someone with no patience for conversation that leads nowhere. He interviewed me in under 15 minutes. He asked whether I had experience in retail, whether I could manage stock, whether I was willing to work on weekends. I said yes to everything, because it was true. He did not ask about documentation directly, and I did not raise the subject. I was hired to work 4 days a week, starting in the morning and finishing in the mid-afternoon. Payment would be in cash, handed directly to me at the end of each week. The amount was significantly less than the American minimum wage. I knew this because Divya had explained the numbers to me beforehand. But even so, converted to rupees, it was more than what the shop at home earned in a full month. I accepted without hesitation. The first weeks of work were exhausting in a way unlike anything I had known before. At my family's shop, the tiredness was physical, but the environment was familiar. I knew every customer by name. I knew what each one liked. I could relax a little between one customer and the next. At Rajan's shop, I was constantly on alert, paying attention to the English of customers, trying to understand different accents, trying not to make mistakes with the change, trying to learn where each product was kept before looking lost in front of someone. English was the greatest challenge. I understood much more than I could speak. I would get stuck mid-sentence, searching for the right word, while the customer waited with an expression that was sometimes patient and sometimes not. There were days I would return to the flat and sit in silence for hours, just processing the effort it had taken simply to work. But something sustained me. Every week, when Rajan placed the money in my hand, I set aside a portion to save and transferred another portion home. The first transfer I made to my parents' account was small, because I was still paying back the initial expenses. But when my mother called to confirm it had arrived, her voice was different. There was something of relief mixed with pride that I could not hear without feeling a lump in my throat. That was the fuel. That was what made me get up every day and go back. Divya's flat started feeling crowded after the second week. She said nothing, but I could sense it. The other flatmate, Meena, was a good woman, but the space was too small for 3 people. When someone in the community mentioned there was a room available in a shared flat at a reasonable price, within walking distance of the shop, I decided to move. The new room was shared with 2 other women. One was Preethi, from Tamil Nadu, who worked as a cook at a restaurant. The other was Sunita, from Uttar Pradesh, who cleaned offices at night. We were 3 women from different parts of India, with different accents, eating slightly different food, but all living the same story with minor variations. We worked, we saved, we sent money home, we slept little and did not complain much, because complaining felt like a luxury none of us could afford. We had got there at a very high cost. Giving up or lamenting was not an option that fit in that small flat. In those moments, I would find myself thinking about my parents. My father holding my face before I entered the airport. My mother packing the spices. Those savings they had built over years and handed over for my journey. I used these images as an anchor. Whenever tiredness tried to convince me it was not worth it, I brought these pictures back. There was something I knew but had placed in a separate compartment of my mind. Something I did not think about directly, but which was always there, like a red light blinking on a panel I had decided to ignore. My documentation status was not legal. I was in the United States on a tourist visa that did not authorize me to work. Every day I spent working in that shop was a day outside the rules. I knew it. Rajan knew it. The girls in the flat knew it. The community around us knew it. But when everyone around you is doing the same thing and life continues to function, it becomes very easy to start believing that the risk is abstract, that it is something that happens to other people, in other cities, in other stories. Not to you. Not now. Not when things are going well. This is one of the most dangerous forms hope can take, when it begins to function as denial. It was on a Thursday of the third week that Rajan asked me to stay back late to help with a new shipment of products arriving at the end of the day. I agreed. It was nearly 7 in the evening when we left, me and 2 other workers from the shop, a young man called Vikram, and an older woman called Kamala. Rajan drove off in his car. The 3 of us walked, because the flat was about 15 minutes away and the weather that evening was manageable. We were perhaps 5 minutes from the flat when a vehicle pulled up to the curb beside us. I did not immediately understand what was happening. I thought it was a routine check, something ordinary that I had not yet learned how things worked in that country. 2 officers got out. They were not regular police. The vest they wore had letters I took a second to read, but when I read them, I felt the ground disappear from under my feet. ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. What happened in the next few minutes is something I need to tell carefully, because every detail was etched into me in a way I cannot erase. They asked for documents. Vikram had something that put him in a less immediate position. Kamala was trembling beside me. I took the passport out of my bag with hands that were not quite obeying. The officer looked at the passport, looked at the visa stamp, looked at me, and I saw in his face that he already knew everything he needed to know. There is a kind of fear that paralyses. Not the fear of an argument, not the fear of losing a job, not the fear of going through an embarrassing situation. It is a fear that occupies the entire body, that makes the knees lose their steadiness, that dries the mouth in an instant, that turns thought into white noise without shape or direction. That was the fear I felt when the officer held my passport and began asking questions in English, with a voice that had no intention of reassuring me. He asked where I was working. I said I was visiting family. He asked again, in a different way, looking in the direction we had come from, as if he already knew the answer and was only testing whether I would lie. Kamala beside me had started crying silently. Vikram was answering questions with the other officer a few meters away. I did not lie again. I do not know whether it was because I was too frightened to construct a story, or because some part of me understood there was no way out. I said I was working at the shop. I said the name of the place. I said I'd been in the country for just over 3 weeks. The officer noted everything down. What followed is a process I will describe as best I can, but which for a long time I could not even speak about without that suffocating feeling returning. Kamala and I were taken in a vehicle, not handcuffed, but with clear instructions not to move, not to try to open the doors, to keep our hands visible. Vikram was separated from us. I do not know what happened to him after. I never found out. The vehicle went to a detention facility. I will not say it was a horrible place physically. It was clean, organized, cold, but it was a place where you entered through a door in one way and the door closed from the outside. That changes everything. No matter whether the floor is marble or concrete, when the door closes from outside and you do not have the key, the place is a prison. We were asked to hand over our belongings: bag, phone, documents. Everything was placed in plastic bags with labels. We went through a registration process that lasted hours. Photographs, fingerprints, the same questions repeated by different people. I answered everything with the most stable voice I could manage, but inside I was collapsing in layers. The thought that assaulted me throughout was not about me. It was about my parents. Kamala was older and had far more life experience than me. Even in that state, she tried to guide me. She whispered things while we waited. She said I needed to ask to speak to someone from the Indian consulate. She said I should not sign anything without fully understanding what I was signing. She said I should be polite and cooperative, but should not give up any right without knowing what that right was. I listened to everything and tried to hold on to it, but my mind was in a place very difficult to control. That first night, I did not sleep. I lay on a thin mattress inside a room with other women who were also not sleeping. Some were talking in low voices. One was praying. Another stared at the ceiling without blinking. I mentally joined the group staring at the ceiling. I kept thinking about how I would explain this to my parents, thinking about my mother's voice when I called, thinking about my father's face at the airport and how that image, which I had kept as something sacred, would now be colored by this other image I was living through, thinking about the savings they had handed over with so much trust, and how all of it was going to end without my having managed to change a single thing. On the second day, I got to speak with a representative from the Indian consulate. It was a short, formal conversation, through a glass partition. He explained what was happening in legal terms. I had entered on a tourist visa and worked without authorization. This constituted a violation of the visa conditions. The deportation process had been initiated. I could contest it, but he was honest. Given the short time I had been in the country and the absence of any supporting legal documentation, the chances of reversal were very small. He asked whether I wanted to contact a family member. I said yes. I gave him Divya's number. The call with Divya was the first time I cried properly since I had been detained. She answered, and before I could say anything, she was already crying too, because someone from the community had already told her what had happened that night. She said my name repeatedly. I tried to speak, but the words would not come out in order. When I managed to collect myself, I asked for one thing. I asked her not to call my parents yet, to let me be the one to tell them. She agreed, but I could hear in her voice how difficult it was to hold back. The days inside that facility had a strange texture, too slow at some moments, too fast at others. The routine was simple and repetitive. Meals at fixed times, a period in a common area, the rest spent inside the detention space. There was not much to do except think, and thinking was the last thing I wanted, but the only thing I could manage. I met other women during those days, different stories, different countries, but with a similar shape. People who had come looking for something better, who had found work within communities that operated in a parallel economy, who had built a fragile but functional routine, and who, at some point, had come face to face with the consequence that had always been there, waiting. One of the women, who had come from a Central American country and had been in the country for 2 years before being detained, said something that stayed with me. She said the worst part is not the deportation itself. The worst part is the return, because you go back to the same place, but you are no longer the same person, and the place no longer sees you the same way either. I did not fully understand what she meant at that moment. I would understand later. On the 5th day, I was called to a room where the formal documents of the process were presented to me. A staff member explained in slow English, with a translator beside her, what was happening. I had the option to formally contest or to accept voluntary deportation. The officer explained the implications of each path without advising me in either direction. I asked for time to think. I spent 2 hours alone in a corridor with that paper in my hand. I read and reread without really processing. I thought about the implications of contesting, the time it would take, the cost of a lawyer I had no way to pay, the uncertainty of an outcome the consulate representative had already signaled would be unfavorable. I also thought about what signing that paper would mean. It would mean leaving. It would mean returning to Karim Nagar with one suitcase and nothing more than I had taken. I signed. It was not weakness. I need to tell myself that even today, because there are moments the doubt returns. But at that moment, with the information I had and the resources I did not have, signing was the most honest decision I could make. Contesting would have kept me in detention for weeks or months, generating costs my family could not afford, to most likely arrive at the same result in the end. I signed and went back to the detention space to wait for the flight date. It was in that interval that I called my parents. I called my mother's mobile because I felt she would handle the impact differently from my father, and I was afraid for his heart. She answered on the second ring. She said hello in the voice of someone expecting good news. I started to speak and could not finish the first sentence. She understood before I had explained anything. Mothers understand. She was silent for a moment and then said, in a voice I had never heard from her before, a low, controlled voice that was more frightening than any shouting would have been. Adira, tell me. I told her everything, every part, without leaving anything out, because leaving things out at that moment would have been a cowardice I would not allow myself. I heard her take deep breaths several times while I spoke. I heard her call my father at some point and explain to him in a low voice, thinking I was not listening, but I heard everything. My father said nothing for a long time after he came to the phone. Then he said only, "Are you well? Is your health all right?" I said yes. He said, "Then we will sort out the rest." I cried in a way I had not been able to cry since I had been detained, because those 6 words from my father contained a generosity I did not deserve in that moment, and which he offered anyway. The deportation flight was scheduled for a Tuesday. I would be accompanied to the gate by 2 officers and handed over to airline staff who were aware of the situation. There would be no restraints on the plane, but there would be supervision during the boarding process. On the morning of the flight, my belongings were returned to me. The bag, the phone with a dead battery, the passport with a new annotation, I glanced at quickly and then put away without wanting to confront it. Kamala was being processed differently because of a more complex legal situation. We could not say a proper goodbye, just a look from a distance as I was guided in a different direction. I carried the suitcase that Divya had managed to recover and leave with the facility administration. Inside it were the clothes I had brought, the spices my mother had packed, the small photograph of the temple near our home. The money I had saved during those first weeks of work had been partly used on the shared room. What remained was very little, not enough for anything beyond a few days' expenses. I boarded the plane carrying all of this, and with the weight of knowing I was returning to the same place I had left, but that something fundamental had changed. Not just out there, inside me too. The plane landed in Hyderabad on a morning with that golden light the sun makes when it is rising and the heat has not yet arrived in full. I looked out the window when the wheels touched the ground and felt something I cannot call relief, but which was not pure sadness either. It was something in between, a kind of recognition, like when you have been ill for a long time and the body finally stops fighting and simply rests, even though the problem has not yet been resolved. I was home. Except coming home this way was nothing like what I had imagined when I left. The arrival process was bureaucratic. There were specific procedures for those arriving under deportation, officers asking questions, forms, verifications. It was not humiliating in the sense that anyone was cruel, but it was dehumanizing in a more subtle way, the way a process turns you into a number, a case, a file, before returning you to the world. When I finally stepped outside the terminal, my parents were there. My mother embraced me before I had finished walking towards them. She held me with a strength I had not expected from her. She is a small woman with gentle movements. My father stood one step back. When my mother finally let me go, I looked at him. He had aged. I do not know whether it happened during those days, or whether it was something I had never noticed before because I was too close to see, but he looked heavier, as if he had been carrying something the whole time I was away. He embraced me too, quickly, firmly, without words. The journey back to Karim Nagar was almost entirely silent. My mother held my hand in the back seat. My father drove. The landscape was familiar in a way that hurt. The same trees, the same small towns you pass without stopping, the same signboards I had seen my whole life without ever really reading. Everything the same. And me, completely different inside that same scenery. The first days at home were strange in a way that is difficult to explain to someone who has not lived through something similar. Physically, I was there, sleeping in my bed, eating at the family table, listening to the familiar sounds of the street outside. But it was as if I were slightly displaced from everything, as if there were a thin sheet of glass between me and the world around me. My mother asked nothing in those first days. She placed food on the table, asked if I wanted chai, commented on simple things about the day. My father went to the shop in the morning and came back in the afternoon. Life around me continued at the pace it always had. The problem was that I did not know how to keep pace alongside it. I would lie awake at night going over sequences of events, revisiting every decision I had made, every moment where I could have chosen differently. If I had asked more questions before going, if I had better understood the risks, if I had been more honest with my parents about the fragility of the plan, if I had not accepted work in a place without the proper documentation. The what-ifs were endless and completely useless, because the past was closed. But my mind insisted on continuing to try to open it. The community in Karim Nagar is small enough for news to travel fast. I do not know exactly how the story reached people, whether it was someone from the network Divya knew, whether it was a detail that leaked from some conversation. The fact is that within less than a week, I could see in people's glances that they knew. Not everything, perhaps, but enough. There is a specific kind of judgment that happens in silence, not the kind of judgment that someone voices in front of you and that you can respond to. It is the judgment in the way an acquaintance of your mother's looks away when she sees you on the street. That is in the question someone does not ask, but which is clearly on the tip of their tongue. That is in the excessive kindness of certain people who are being too kind precisely because they feel sorry for you. I hated the pity. It was the hardest thing to swallow during that entire period. Not the situation itself, but other people's pity on top of it. 2 weeks after I arrived home, my father called me for a conversation on the back veranda, the same place where he had given me his answer about the trip months before. I went with a knot in my stomach, not knowing what to expect. He spent some time looking at the garden before speaking. Then he turned to me and said he wanted to understand what had really happened. Not the summary I had given over the phone during the detention. Not the short version I had given my mother in the car. What had really happened, from beginning to end. I told him everything. It took over an hour. My father did not interrupt me once. He listened with that ability of his to be completely still while he absorbs information. When I finished, he was silent for a few minutes. Then he said, "You knew about the risks before you went." It was not a question. It was a statement. I could have tried to soften it, but I did not. I did, I replied. He nodded slowly. And you did not tell us fully. I did not tell you fully, I confirmed. He was silent again. Then he said something I had not expected. I also did not ask enough, because I wanted to believe it would work out just as much as you did. That disarmed me in a way that no argument could have, because he was right, and because he was claiming a part of what I had been carrying alone as absolute guilt, not to absolve me, but because it was honest, because he really had also chosen to believe when he could have questioned more. We sat together in silence for a while, looking at the garden. It was not a heavy silence. It was the silence of two people who have arrived at the same place by different paths and who need to decide together what comes next. What came next was slow, much slower than I would have wanted. I went back to the shop. There was no immediate alternative, and the family needed me there. But it was different from before. Before, I had been in the shop waiting for something to change. Now I was in the shop carrying the proof that I had tried to change things and had failed in a way that cost more than money. The debts were real. The savings were gone. Part of what I had earned in those weeks of work had been consumed by the process of simply being there. What came back with me was almost nothing. This meant the shop now had to function without the reserve it had before, that any unexpected expense had less room to be absorbed, that the family's financial breathing space had shrunk in a concrete way. I felt that weight on every working day. Every sale I made, every rupee that came into the counter, I would mentally calculate how long it would take to rebuild what had been lost. It was Divya who said something that shifted the angle from which I was seeing everything. She called a few weeks after I returned. She was worried and also felt guilty, because she had been part of the process that led me there. We talked for a long time. At some point she said, Adira, you went and you came back. A lot of people never go. That means something. I heard that and at first thought it was one of those empty consoling phrases people say when they do not know what else to say. But I kept thinking about it in the days that followed. I let the phrase settle. I had gone. With all the flaws in the planning, with all the fragility of the project, with all the naivety about the risks. I had bought the ticket, boarded the plane, crossed the ocean, found work in 2 weeks, built a routine, sent money home. I had done all of this in a country whose language I did not fully master, in a city I had never seen, with no formal safety net. And I had come back, at an enormous cost. But I had come back whole. This did not erase anything that had happened, but it began to change something in the way I saw myself. I started doing what I should have done long before considering any trip. Real research. Not stories from people's relatives. Not messages from cousins and family WhatsApp groups. Real research. About professional exchange programs. About work visas based on qualifications. About nursing diplomas with recognized accreditation that had tie-ups with international institutions. I began to understand that the world of legal work visas is complex and slow, but it exists, and that there are paths which do not require you to give up your security in order to try to reach something better. I found a state program in Telangana that offered partial subsidies for healthcare technical courses for people above 30 who had interrupted their studies. I qualified. I applied. I was selected. The course would begin in 4 months. I will not say that everything became fine all at once. It did not. The debts continued to exist. The shop continued to need my presence. The glances from certain people in the community continued for a while, until other matters filled the space. The passport continued to carry that annotation, which would complicate any future visa application for years. But something changed in me that is permanent, and which, with time, I realized is not a bad thing. I stopped waiting for life to change on its own. I stopped looking at what other people had and using that as the measure of what I should have. I began to understand that dreams without structure are only wishes, and that wishes without action are only suffering postponed. The trip cost me $2,000, my family's savings, 1 month of my freedom, and an amount of dignity that took time to rebuild. But it also cost me something I needed to lose, the illusion that there is a shortcut which works without consequence. Today I am in my 2nd year of the nursing diploma course. I work in the shop in the mornings and attend class in the afternoons. I sleep less than I should and study more than I thought I could. My father sometimes watches me while I'm studying at the kitchen table and says nothing, but I can see that he is seeing something that satisfies him in a way that is different from before. My mother makes chai without being asked when she sees me with my books open late at night. And I, who spent years feeling I was falling behind, have finally understood that behind and ahead are concepts that only make sense once you first define where you are trying to go. I am trying to go somewhere real, with a ticket bought the right way, with papers in order, with a qualification that belongs to me and that no one can deport. It will take longer than I wanted, but it will last.